The sky above Kethsora burned orange and red as another wave of bombs fell upon the capital city, and the ground shook with such terrible force that even the mountains seemed to tremble in fear. Commander Kira Vasquez stood at the observation deck of the orbital station called Haven's Rest, and she watched the destruction below with cold fury building in her chest, her hands gripping the metal railing so tight that her knuckles turned white. She was human, one of only 12 stationed on this alien world as military advisors, and she had grown to love these people over the past 3 years of service among them. The Volanthi were a gentle species, fox-like creatures with silver fur that shimmered in the light and large, amber eyes that showed every emotion they felt without hiding anything at all. They were poets and artists and scientists who had never known war until the Dominion of Scales arrived in their system 6 months ago, with a fleet of warships that blocked out the stars themselves. The Dominion were reptilian conquerors who had crushed a dozen worlds beneath their clawed feet, and they showed no mercy to anyone who stood in their path of endless expansion across the galaxy. Kira turned away from the viewport as alarms began to sound throughout the station, and she walked with purpose toward the command center, where chaos had already taken hold of everyone inside. Volanthi officers ran back and forth with datapads in their delicate hands, their ears flat against their skulls in the universal sign of their species' distress, and their voices overlapped in panicked chatter that filled the air. "We have lost contact with the eastern settlements," one officer reported with a trembling voice that betrayed his youth and inexperience in matters of war and death. "The shield generators in Sector 7 have failed completely," another called out from across the room where screens flickered with red warning symbols. Kira moved through them like a stone in a river, steady and unmoved by the current of fear that swept everyone else along, and she reached the central console where General Theron waited for her arrival. Theron was old for a Volanthi. His silver fur faded to white around his muzzle, and his eyes held the weight of watching his world die around him piece by piece each passing day. "Commander Vasquez," he said in the formal tone that Volanthi used when they were trying very hard not to show their emotions, "the Council has ordered a full evacuation of all remaining civilians to the colony ships." "How long do we have?" Kira asked without any softness in her voice, because softness would not save anyone today or any day that followed. 7 hours at most, before the Dominion breaks through our orbital defenses entirely," Theron replied, and his tail drooped low behind him in a gesture of defeat that made Kira's heart ache. She opened her mouth to respond when a junior officer suddenly rushed toward them with wide eyes and fur standing on end in pure terror. "General, Commander, we have received a distress signal from the Hollow Ridge region," the young Volanthi gasped out between rapid breaths. "It is from the underground shelter where we sent the orphan cubs 3 days ago for safety." Kira felt something cold grip her stomach and squeeze with an iron fist of dread. She remembered the cubs, remembered visiting them before they were evacuated to what everyone believed would be a safe location far from the fighting. There had been 12 of them, ranging from tiny infants to children of perhaps 10 years in human terms, all of them orphaned by the war that had stolen their families away forever. She remembered one in particular, a small female named Veth, who had grabbed Kira's hand and asked if the scary lizards would find them in the mountains, and Kira had promised her that she would be safe there. "Play the signal," Kira commanded in a voice that left no room for argument or delay. The officer nodded and pressed several buttons on his console, and then a crackling transmission filled the command center with sound that made everyone fall silent at once. Static hissed and popped for several seconds before a voice emerged from the noise, old and strained with effort and fear combined. "This is Sereth, caretaker of the Hollow Ridge shelter, calling anyone who can hear my words," the voice said with desperate urgency. "The Dominion has found us somehow, and they are cutting through the blast door as I speak these words to you." More static interrupted the message, and then the sound of plasma cutters could be heard in the background. a high-pitched whine that Kira recognized from 100 battlefields across her military career. "We have 12 cubs with me in the deepest tunnel, and I have sealed us inside. But the door will not hold for long against their weapons," Sereth continued with a voice that cracked with emotion. "Please, if anyone hears this, we need help immediately, or these children will die." A child's voice cut through the transmission then, high and thin with terror that no young creature should ever have to feel. "Please help us," the small voice cried out. "Please, someone, anyone. The monsters are coming for us." The transmission dissolved into static, and then silence fell upon the command center, like a heavy blanket smothering all hope beneath its weight. Kira looked at the coordinates displayed on the screen, and her mind raced through calculations of distance and time, and probability of survival. Hollow Ridge was deep behind enemy lines now, surrounded by Dominion forces who would shoot down any rescue shuttle before it got within 100 kilometers of the location. General Theron shook his head slowly, with sorrow plain upon his aged face. "There is nothing we can do for them," he said in barely more than a whisper. "The Council has already declared that region as lost territory beyond our ability to save." "You are going to abandon children to those monsters?" Kira asked with disbelief dripping from every word she spoke. "We do not have the resources to mount a rescue mission behind enemy lines," Theron explained with pain in his eyes that showed he hated these words, even as he said them. "One shuttle would be destroyed before it reached halfway there, and we cannot spare the fighters to escort it through." Kira stared at him for a long moment as her jaw tightened and her eyes hardened into something cold and dangerous that made the Volanti officers nearby step back from her in instinctive fear. "Then I will go alone," she said simply, as if she were discussing the weather rather than a suicide mission into enemy territory. "That is impossible," Theron protested with his ears pressing flat against his skull. "You would die before you ever reached them. And even if you did somehow survive the journey down, you could never fight through the Dominion forces waiting there." Kira was already walking toward the door, and she did not look back as she called over her shoulder, "Watch me." The Volanti in the command center stared after her with expressions of shock and confusion on their gentle faces, unable to understand what they had just witnessed. They did not know what humans were truly capable of when innocent lives hung in the balance. But they were about to learn a lesson that would echo across the stars for generations to come. Kira ran through the corridors of Haven's Rest Station with her boots, pounding against the metal floor in a rhythm that matched the racing of her heart. She pushed past evacuating civilians and dodged around supply crates that had been left in the hallways during the chaos of the retreat from their dying world. Her mind was focused on one thing and one thing only, and that was reaching those children before the Dominion soldiers broke through the door that protected them. She burst into the hangar bay where emergency vehicles were stored and immediately spotted what she needed standing in the corner covered in a gray tarp. It was a single-person drop pod designed for emergency insertions into hostile territory, a brutal and simple machine that would carry her through the atmosphere like a meteor falling from the heavens. Lieutenant Chen, another human advisor who had been helping coordinate the evacuation, spotted her and jogged over with confusion written across his face. "Vasquez, what are you doing here?" he asked as he watched her pull the tarp off the drop pod. "We have orders to evacuate with the last transport in 7 minutes. There are children trapped in Hollow Ridge," Kira replied without stopping her preparations, her hands moving with practiced speed as she checked the pod systems. "I'm going to get them out." Chung grabbed her arm and turned her to face him with serious eyes. "That is suicide, and you know it," he said firmly. "The area is crawling with Dominion forces, and you would be going in completely alone with no backup and no extraction plan." Kira met his gaze without flinching. 12 cubs are going to die if someone does not do something right now," she said in a voice as hard as steel. "I made a promise to one of them that she would be safe, and I intend to keep that promise." You cannot save everyone, Kira, Chun said with his voice softening into something like sorrow. Maybe not, she admitted as she pulled her arm free from his grip. But I can save these 12 today, and that will have to be enough. She climbed into the drop pod and began strapping herself into the harness that would keep her from being torn apart by the violent forces of atmospheric entry. Chun stood watching her with conflict playing across his features before he finally let out a long breath and shook his head. You are completely insane, he said, but there was respect in his voice now rather than protest. What do you need? Cover my launch and buy me as much time as you can before reporting me as missing, Kira replied as she pulled on her combat helmet. And Chun, if I do not make it back, tell my family that I'm doing something that mattered. Chun nodded once and then stepped back as the pod's hatch began to close. Give them hell, Commander, he called out just before the metal sealed shut and darkness surrounded her. Kira took 3 deep breaths to steady her nerves and then initiated the launch sequence. The pod shot out of the hangar bay like a bullet from a gun. And within seconds, she was falling toward the burning world below with nothing between her and death but skill and luck and sheer human stubbornness. Far beneath her, deep within the mountain tunnels of Hollow Ridge, the 12 cubs huddled together in a tight cluster of trembling bodies and whimpering voices. Old Sareth stood before them with his back to the door that glowed brighter and hotter with each passing moment as the plasma cutters on the other side ate through the metal inch by inch. He was ancient even by Volanthi standards, his fur nearly white and his body bent with age, but he refused to let his fear show in front of the children who depended on him. In his hands, he held a ceremonial blade called a Kethvora, a weapon meant for rituals and traditions rather than actual combat, but it was all he had to defend his charges. Sareth, I am scared, little Veth whimpered from somewhere in the middle of the group, her silver fur matted with tears and her amber eyes huge with terror. I know, little one, Sareth replied in the gentlest voice he could manage while his own heart pounded with fear. But you must be brave now, braver than you have ever been before. Are the monsters going to hurt us? Another cub asked. Barely more than an infant with wobbly legs and a voice that squeaked with youth. Sareth did not answer because he could not bring himself to lie to them, and he could not bear to tell them the truth. The Dominion did not take prisoners, especially not children of conquered species. He had heard the stories from other worlds. Terrible stories of what happened to those who fell into the claws of the reptilian conquerors. And he prayed to every spirit he knew that these innocent souls would be spared such a fate. The door groaned as another section of metal gave way to the cutting beams, and now Sareth could see the glow of the plasma through the gaps that had formed in the barrier. He estimated they had perhaps 5 minutes left before the door collapsed entirely. Children, I need you to move to the very back of the tunnel, he instructed with a calm he did not feel. Press yourselves against the wall and stay as quiet as you possibly can. The cubs obeyed without question, their instincts telling them to follow the commands of their elder in this moment of crisis. Veth was the last to move, and she paused to look at Sareth with eyes that held a question she was too afraid to ask. Go, little one, Sareth urged her gently. I will protect you for as long as I am able. She nodded and scurried to join the others, disappearing into the shadows at the far end of the tunnel. Sareth turned back to face the door and raised his ceremonial blade with arms that trembled despite his best efforts to hold them steady. He knew he would die in the next few minutes. He knew his blade would do nothing against the armored soldiers who would come through that door. But he also knew that every second he bought the children was a second more of life, a second more of hope, a second more of chance that somehow a miracle might save them. The door finally gave way with a terrible screech of tortured metal, and it crashed to the ground with a boom that echoed through the tunnel like thunder. Dominion soldiers poured through the opening, their massive forms silhouetted against the light from behind, their thermal lances humming with deadly energy. There were 8 of them, each one standing over 8 feet tall with black chitinous armor covering their scaled bodies and eyes that glowed red in the darkness. Their commander stepped forward, larger than the others, with ornate markings on his armor that signified his rank and his many conquests. His forked tongue flicked out to taste the air, and a sound like grinding rocks emerged from his throat that might have been laughter. "Small prey," he hissed in broken galactic common, his voice cold and cruel. "Scared prey." He looked at Sareth with contempt and amusement mixed together in his reptilian gaze. "Old One thinks to fight us with tiny blade," the commander mocked as his soldiers spread out behind him. "We will make this slow for your defiance." Sareth held his ground even as his legs threatened to buckle beneath him. "You will not touch these children," he declared with every ounce of courage he could summon. The commander raised his thermal lens and pointed it directly at the old Valante's chest. "Nothing can save you now," he hissed with absolute certainty. And then the ceiling exploded. Rocks and dust and debris rained down from above as something tore through the ceiling of the tunnel with explosive force that sent the Dominion soldiers stumbling backward in surprise. Through the cloud of destruction dropped a figure wrapped in combat armor, hitting the ground in a crouch that absorbed the impact of the fall with practiced ease. Kira rose to her full height, which was small compared to the massive reptilian warriors surrounding her. And in her hands she held a weapon that looked crude and brutal next to the elegant technology of the galactic community. It was a shotgun, a human design that had been perfected over centuries of warfare on a world that had never known peace for long. Loaded with fragmenting rounds designed to tear through armor and flesh with equal efficiency. For a single heartbeat, everyone in the tunnel froze as they tried to understand what had just happened. The Dominion soldiers stared at the human with confusion because they had expected reinforcements from above, or perhaps a collapse of the tunnel. Not a single small creature dropping into their midst like a demon from the void. Then Kira opened fire, and the tunnel became a symphony of chaos and death. The first blast caught the nearest soldier directly in the chest, and the fragmenting rounds punched through his armor like it was made of paper, sending him crashing backward into his companions. Kira was already moving before the body hit the ground, her legs carrying her forward in a charge that no sane being would attempt against 7 armed and armored soldiers. But humans were not known for their sanity when innocent lives were at stake. She fired again and again, each shot finding its target with deadly precision born from years of training in combat, experience across a dozen different worlds. The second soldier fell with his throat torn open. The third took a blast to the knee that shattered his leg and sent him screaming to the floor. The Dominion soldiers finally began to react, raising their thermal lances and firing beams of concentrated heat toward the human, who had appeared among them like a nightmare made flesh. Kira ducked under the first beam and rolled past the second, her body moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for such a violent dance of death. A third beam caught her shoulder, and she felt the searing pain as it burned through her armor and into the flesh beneath. But she did not stop, did not slow, did not even cry out. She kept firing until her shotgun clicked empty, and then she threw it at the face of the nearest soldier with enough force to crack his visor. In the same motion, she drew her combat knife, a wicked blade of blackened steel that had been her companion through more battles than she could count. The fourth soldier swung his massive arm at her head with enough force to crush her skull. But Kira was already inside his reach, her knife finding the gap between his armor plates and sinking deep into his side. She twisted the blade and ripped it free in a spray of dark blood, then spun to face the next attacker. The fifth soldier fired his lance point blank, but Kira grabbed his arm and redirected the beam into the sixth soldier's chest, using the enemy's own weapon to kill his companion. She drove her knife up through the fifth soldier's jaw and into his brain, ending him instantly. The seventh soldier charged at her with a roar of rage and fear mixed together, his claws extended to tear her apart. Kira met his charge head-on, ducking under his grasping arms and driving her shoulder into his midsection with all her weight behind it. The impact would not have moved him if she had been any other species, but humans had evolved on a heavy gravity world with dense bones and muscles that were far stronger than their small frames suggested. The soldier stumbled, and that moment of imbalance was all Kira needed. She swept his legs out from under him and was on top of him before he hit the ground, a knife rising and falling in a brutal rhythm until he stopped moving. Only the commander remained standing, and for the first time in his long career of conquest and slaughter, he felt something he had never experienced before. He felt fear. Kira stood before him, covered in blood, both her own and that of his fallen soldiers, her chest heaving with exertion and her eyes burning with a fire that seemed to come from somewhere beyond mere physical existence. She had taken 3 wounds that the commander could see, injuries that would have incapacitated any Volante or any other species he had ever encountered. Yet she stood as if they meant nothing at all. "What are you?" the commander hissed, his forked tongue flicking nervously as he raised his thermal lance with hands that trembled slightly. Kira smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I am human," she said simply, as if that explained everything. To those who knew humanity's reputation across the galaxy, it did. The Dominion had studied humans from a distance, had read the reports compiled by their intelligence officers about this strange species from a death world called Earth. They knew humans were classified as Class 4 persistent predators, creatures who had evolved to chase their prey across impossible distances until exhaustion claimed them. They knew humans had forward-facing eyes like all apex predators, designed to track and focus on targets with terrifying intensity. They knew humans formed pack bonds not just with their own kind, but with any creature they deemed worthy of their protection. But knowing these things as facts in a report was very different from seeing them in action. The commander fired his thermal lance, but Kira was already moving, sliding under the beam and closing the distance between them in the span of a heartbeat. Her knife slashed across his weapon arm, severing tendons and sending the lance clattering to the ground. He swung at her with his other arm, his claws raking across her side and drawing more blood. But she did not retreat. Instead, she stepped closer, inside his guard where his size became a disadvantage, and she looked up into his glowing red eyes with an expression of absolute determination. "You came here to kill children," Kira said in a voice as cold as the void between stars. She drove her knife into his chest, finding the gap in his armor where the plates met over his heart. "You came to the wrong tunnel," she finished as she twisted the blade. The commander collapsed, his massive body crashing to the ground with a thud that seemed to shake the entire mountain. Silence fell over the tunnel, broken only by the sound of Kira's labored breathing and the soft whimpering of the cubs hidden in the shadows behind her. She stood there for a moment, swaying slightly as the adrenaline began to fade and the pain of her wounds started to make itself known. Then she turned to face the darkness where the children hid, and her expression softened from cold killer to gentle protector in an instant. "It is safe now," she called out in a voice that was warm despite her exhaustion. "You can come out." Old Sheriff emerged first, his ceremonial blade still clutched in his trembling hands and his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror at what he had just witnessed. He had seen warriors fight before, had watched soldiers train in the arts of combat, but he had never seen anything like what this human had just done. She had walked into a room full of enemies who outweighed her by hundreds of pounds each, and she had killed them all with nothing but a crude weapon and her bare hands. "How?" he whispered, unable to form a more coherent question. Kira met his gaze and shrugged as if she had not just performed an impossible feat of violence and survival. "They threatened children," she said simply. "That made them dead already." One by one, the cubs emerged from the shadows, their amber eyes huge as they looked at the carnage around them and then at the small human woman who had wrought it. Little Veth was the last to appear, and she walked straight to Kira and wrapped her small arms around the human's legs. "You came," Veth said in a voice thick with tears. "You promised you would keep me safe, and you came." Kira knelt down, wincing at the movement but ignoring the pain, and she gathered the small cub into her arms. "I will always come," she promised. The tunnel stretched before him like a dark throat, leading deeper into the mountain, and Kira led the way with a small flashlight in one hand and a salvaged thermal lance in the other. Behind her walked the 12 cubs in a tight cluster, their small feet padding softly against the stone floor, with old Sereth bringing up the rear to keep watch on the children. They had been walking for nearly an hour, and Kira could feel her wounds screaming with every step she took. But she refused to show any sign of weakness in front of those who depended on her. The smallest cubs had grown tired quickly, their young legs not built for such long journeys through rough terrain, and Kira now carried 2 of them in her arms, while a third clung to her back. The weight should have been too much for someone in her condition, but humans had a gift for ignoring what should be impossible when someone needed them. "How much farther?" Sereth asked in a hushed voice, his breath coming in short gasps from the exertion of the trek. Kira consulted the map displayed on her wrist device and calculated the remaining distance to the emergency exit coordinates she had downloaded before her drop. "About 6 more kilometers," she replied, keeping her voice calm and steady, despite the exhaustion that pulled at every muscle in her body. "We should reach the surface exit point in approximately 2 hours if we maintain this pace." Sereth looked at her with concern in his amber eyes. "You are injured badly," he observed, noting the blood that continued to seep through the makeshift bandages she had applied during a brief rest stop. "Perhaps we should take a longer break so you can tend to your wounds properly." Kira shook her head firmly. "We cannot stop for long," she explained as she adjusted the cubs in her arms to distribute their weight more evenly. "The Dominion will discover their patrol is missing, and they will send more soldiers to investigate." "What will we do if they catch up to us?" Little Veth asked from her position clinging to Kira's leg, her small hand gripping the fabric of the human's pants with desperate strength. Kira looked down at the cub and offered her a small smile. "Then I will deal with them the same way I dealt with the others," she said with confidence she was not entirely sure she felt. "But it would be better if we do not give them the chance to find us." They continued through the winding tunnels, passing through ancient mining chambers that had been abandoned long before the war began and had been repurposed as emergency shelters when the invasion started. The children were remarkably quiet for one so young, their survival instincts telling them that silence could mean the difference between life and death in this dark and dangerous place. Only occasional whimpers broke the stillness when a cub stumbled on the uneven ground, or when the distant rumble of explosions from the surface made its way down to their ears. During their second rest stop, Kira sat against the tunnel wall and allowed herself to examine her wounds more closely. The thermal lance burn on her shoulder was bad, the flesh blackened around the edges and weeping clear fluid that indicated serious tissue damage. The claw marks on her side were deep, and she suspected at least one of them had cracked the rib based on the sharp pain that accompanied each breath. She had multiple smaller cuts and bruises covering her body, souvenirs from her violent arrival through the ceiling and the brutal fight that had followed. Any one of these injuries would have been enough to put most soldiers out of action. Yet here she was, carrying children through kilometers of underground tunnels with enemies hunting them every step of the way. Sereth watched her tend to herself and shook his head in wonder. "In all my years, I have never seen anyone fight the way you did," he said softly so the cubs would not overhear. "Our warriors trained their entire lives and could not have done what you accomplished in mere minutes." "Humans are stubborn," Kira replied with a grimace as she tightened a bandage around her midsection. "We do not know when to quit." It is more than stubbornness, Sareth insisted, his voice taking on a tone of reverence that made Kira uncomfortable. You moved like the Kathvora of our ancient legends, the guardian spirits who appear to protect the innocent when all hope seems lost. Kira looked at him with curiosity despite her pain. Tell me about these Kathvora, she asked, partially because she was interested, and partially because talking helped distract her from the fire burning across her wounded body. Sarath's eyes grew distant as he recalled the stories passed down through generations of his people. They are beings of immense power who watch over our world from the spirit realm, he explained. It is said that they can sense when innocent souls cry out in true despair, and they will cross the boundary between worlds to answer that call. He looked at Kira with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. When I sent the distress signal, I prayed to them, begging them to save these children, he continued. And then you fell from the sky like a star and destroyed our enemies with fury beyond anything I have ever witnessed. Kira did not know how to respond to being compared to a spirit of legend, so she simply shrugged and stood up with a grunt of pain. I am just a human who heard children in trouble, she said as she prepared to resume their journey. Any of my people would have done the same. Sareth opened his mouth to argue, but was interrupted by one of the cubs tugging at his robes. Sareth, I hear something, the young female whispered with her large ears rotating toward a side passage they had passed moments ago. Everyone froze as Kira strained her human ears to catch whatever sound the more sensitive Valanti had detected. For several heartbeats there was nothing, and then she heard it too, the distant echo of footsteps and the hissing voices of the minion soldiers. They have found our trail, Kira said grimly as she ushered the children forward with increased urgency. We need to move faster. She considered her options as they hurried through the tunnels, her mind racing through tactical calculations, even as her body protested every step. There was no way the cubs could outrun adult Dominion soldiers, and if she tried to stand and fight while protecting 12 children, the outcome would be very different from her earlier battle. She needed to buy them time, and there was only one way to do that. Sareth, she called back over her shoulder as they reached the junction where the tunnel split into 3 separate paths. Take the children down the left passage and keep moving no matter what you hear. The old Valanti's eyes widened as he understood what she intended. You cannot face them alone again, he protested. You are too badly injured, and there could be many more of them this time. That is exactly why I need to face them here, where the tunnel is narrow, Kira explained as she handed the cubs she was carrying to the older children. They cannot use their numbers against me if they can only come at me 1 or 2 at a time. But you will die, Sareth said with horror plain on his face. Kira looked at him with eyes that held no fear, only grim determination. Maybe, she admitted, but every minute I hold them here is another minute for you to get the cubs to safety. She turned to the children and knelt down despite the agony the movement caused. I need you all to be very brave and very fast, she said in a voice that was gentle but firm. Follow Sareth and do not stop until you reach the surface, no matter what. Little Veth threw herself at Kira and wrapped her arms around the human's neck. Please come with us, the cub begged with tears streaming down her silver fur. Please do not leave us. Kira hugged her tightly for a moment that she wished could last forever. I will find you, she promised as she gently pulled the cub away and handed her to Sareth. Now go, quickly. Sareth gathered the children and began herding them down the left passage, but he paused at the entrance to look back at the human who had saved them. Thank you, he said with emotion thick in his voice. Whatever happens, know that you will be remembered as a true Kathvora by my people for all time. Then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness with the children, and Kira was alone. She turned to face the tunnel from which the sounds of pursuit were growing louder and raised her salvaged thermal lance. All right, she muttered to herself as she prepared for what was likely her final fight. Let us see how many of you I can take with me. The first Dominion soldier rounded the corner, and Kira opened fire. Dawn broke over the mountains of Hollow Ridge as Sareth and the 12 cubs emerged from the tunnel exit into the cold morning air, their lungs burning from the final desperate sprint through the last kilometer of underground passages. Behind them, deep within the mountain, the sounds of combat had finally fallen silent, and Sarath's heart ached with the knowledge of what that silence likely meant. The human woman had held the tunnel against wave after wave of Dominion soldiers, her thermal lance firing again and again as she screamed defiance at enemies who should have overwhelmed her in moments. Sareth had heard her voice echoing through the stone corridors long after they had fled, taunting and challenging, and refusing to fall even as more reinforcements arrived to face her. And then the sounds had stopped, and the only thing left was the terrible quiet of the aftermath. Little Veth clung to Sarath's robes and cried without sound, her small body shaking with grief for the human who had promised to find them. "She said she would come," Veth whimpered. "She promised." Sareth gathered the cub into his arms and held her close, not knowing what words could possibly comfort a child who had lost so much in such a short time. The roar of engines suddenly filled the air, and for one horrible moment Sareth thought the Dominion had found them at last, that all of Kira's sacrifice had been for nothing. But the ship that descended from the sky bore the markings of the Volanti resistance, and as it landed on the rocky ground before them, Sareth fell to his knees with relief. The rescue shuttle's door opened and soldiers rushed out to secure the area, their weapons sweeping the tree line for any sign of enemy presence. A medic rushed to Sareth and the children, her eyes widening as she counted the young ones and realized they had all survived. "By the spirits, you made it," she gasped as she began checking the cubs for injuries. "When we received your distress call, we thought it was too late." "A human saved us," Sareth said in a voice that trembled with emotion and exhaustion. "She came alone and fought an army to give us time to escape." The medic paused in her work and stared at him. "A human," she repeated with disbelief. "One human fought the Dominion alone." Before Sareth could respond, one of the soldiers called out from the edge of the landing area. "Contact approaching from the tunnel exit," he shouted, raising his weapon to aim at the dark opening in the mountainside. Everyone turned to look, and Sarath's breath caught in his throat. A figure emerged from the shadows, stumbling and staggering with each step, leaving a trail of dark blood on the rocks behind them. It was Kira. She was barely recognizable, her armor torn and scorched, her body covered in wounds too numerous to count, her face pale from blood loss and her eyes glazed with exhaustion. But she was alive. Veth broke free from Sarath's arms and ran to the human with a cry of pure joy. "You came back," the cub shouted as she threw herself at Kira's legs. "You promised, and you came back." Kira collapsed to her knees, her strength finally giving out now that she could see the children were safe, and she wrapped her arms around Veth with the last energy she had. "I told you I would find you," she whispered before her eyes rolled back and she fell unconscious into the arms of the medics who rushed to catch her. The news spread across the galaxy like wildfire in the days that followed. A single human had dropped alone into enemy territory, fought through impossible odds to rescue 12 alien children, and had held off a Dominion assault force long enough for them to escape. The Dominion commanders analyzed the reports from their surviving soldiers and could not understand how one small creature had killed so many of their warriors. They reviewed the sensor data from the tunnels and watched Kira fight again and again, taking wounds that should have been fatal and continuing to battle as if death itself could not touch her. The Volanti shared the story of the Kethvora who had answered their prayers, and soon every species in the sector knew the name of Commander Kira Vasquez. But it was the response from the human confederacy that truly shook the foundations of the war. 3 days after Kira's rescue, a single transmission was broadcast on all frequencies, ensuring that every ship and station in the region received it simultaneously. The message was simple, containing only 12 words, but those words changed everything. They were children of another world, yet still we came for them. The implied promise in that statement was clear to everyone who heard it. If humans would sacrifice themselves for children of another species, what would they do when their allies asked for help in earnest? The Dominion High Command met an emergency session to discuss this development, and for the first time in their long history of conquest, they experienced doubt. They had expanded their empire by crushing weaker species who could not resist their military might, but they had never faced an enemy who did not calculate the odds before fighting. Humans did not fight because they thought they could win. They fought because they believed some things were worth dying for, and no amount of military superiority could intimidate someone who had already accepted death as an acceptable price. Within 6 months, the tide of the war had turned. Human reinforcements arrived at Kethsora, and the Dominion learned that Kira was not unique among her kind. Every human soldier they faced fought with the same terrifying determination, the same refusal to surrender, the same willingness to sacrifice everything for those they had chosen to protect. The Dominion's advance faltered, then stopped, then began to reverse as world after world was liberated by forces that should have been too small to succeed. 1 year after the children were rescued from Hollow Ridge, the Dominion signed an unconditional surrender. Their empire, which had terrorized the galaxy for centuries, crumbled in the face of an enemy they could not understand and could not defeat. A memorial was erected on Kethsora, placed at the entrance to the tunnels where 12 cubs had nearly met their end. It depicted a human woman standing with her arms spread wide, shielding a group of small figures behind her as she faced a wave of shadows alone. The inscription was written in 100 languages, ensuring that anyone from any world could read its message. Humans do not calculate the odds, it read. They calculate the cost of doing nothing. Kira attended the memorial dedication ceremony, standing with the 12 cubs she had saved, all of whom refused to leave her side throughout the event. Little Veth, who had grown in the past year but still barely reached Kira's waist, held her hand and looked up at the statue with wonder in her amber eyes. "Is that really what you looked like?" Veth asked with curiosity, "when you came to save us?" Kira studied the heroic figure carved in stone and shook her head with a small laugh. "I think the artist made me a bit taller," she admitted. Veth squeezed her hand and leaned against the human's leg. "I want to be like you when I grow up," the cub declared. "I want to protect people who cannot protect themselves." Kira knelt down to look the young Volanthi in the eyes. "You do not need to be human to do that," she said gently. "You just need to care enough to act when others will not." Veth nodded seriously, her eyes filled with determination that reminded Kira of herself at that age. Across the galaxy, species who had once dismissed humanity as soft and sentimental began to understand the truth. Humans were not protectors because they were the strongest or the fastest or the most advanced. They were protectors because they chose to be, because something in their nature compelled them to stand between the innocent and those who would do them harm. And that choice, made freely and without expectation of reward, was more powerful than any weapon the galaxy had ever known. The stars themselves seemed brighter that night as celebrations erupted across Kethsora and somewhere in the heavens. The spirits that the Volanthi called Kethvora smiled upon the world they had adopted as their own. For the humans had come, just as they always did, and they had proven once again that hope was never truly lost as long as even one of them remained standing. And that was a lesson the galaxy would never forget.